So everyone is settling down here. There is a reminder that for people in the room, please do not, if you're in the room, please do not talk at all when Zoom is on, because Zoom will pick up your background speaking. It may actually capture what you say from some other place in the room, but it will pick it up, and it may be noise, and it will interfere with the meeting for people who are on Zoom and on Facebook. This is the March meeting for the Tucson Amateur Astronomy Association, and we're delighted to have everyone here tonight. We are currently working on our lighting in the room a little bit, but we have with us tonight people who are attending in person. We have people who are attending on Facebook, and we have people who are attending through Zoom. So we welcome all of you, and we want you all to have a great experience at our meeting tonight. I do need to ask that people do not move around the room during the meeting, even any more than absolutely necessary to, because that can create some interference. So I'm May Smith. I'm president of the Tucson Amateur Astronomy Association. And tonight we have, helping us with technology, we have Jim Knoll, and we have Cheryl Knoll operating the camera. And we have Terry Lappin, who's going to be doing Facebook for us, and also helping with technology. So we have all of our wonderful people who kind of keep the meeting going, so that hopefully everybody can hear and really have a good experience. Tonight, we have a special event. Some of you were here last month when David Levy was our guest speaker. And David Levy is back with us tonight visiting. And David is going to do a special favor for us, and he's going to introduce our guest speaker for the evening.
Thank you, May. It is really such a pleasure to be here tonight to introduce a very special and dear friend. Tim Hunter and I became friends, well, I think when he was president of the TAAA. It was a few terms after mine ended. And but what really got me was when he gave his first lecture, My Life in Hard Times in Amateur Astronomy. I was absolutely gobsmacked by it. I thought it was the wit he has, the humor, the intelligence, and he's been such a friend over the years, and it really gives me great pleasure to be introducing him tonight. In 1751, I don't think you were alive in 1751. I mean, I was here, but I don't. Nobody's older than me. Thomas Gray put 32 words together that I believe may be the most beautiful 32 words ever written. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea. The plowman homeward plods his weary way and leaves the world to darkness and to me. I love how he uses the darkness, and darkness is how both Tim and I feel about it. Darkness, not depression darkness, but the darkness that follows every sunset when the stars come out and we can enjoy looking at the night sky. Tim's talk tonight is the sky at night, and I know that someone has to be made a fool of tonight, and usually Peter Jedicke and I do this together, but since he isn't here, I mean, I'm going to make a fool of myself right now. And here goes. The sky at night is deep and bright, boom, 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 deep in the heart of southern Arizona. Tim Hunter wrote a book. It's worth a look. Deep in the heart of southern Arizona. It costs $20. It's not that much. Deep in the heart of southern Arizona. The sky at night is deep and bright. Deep in the heart of southern Arizona. And now, my pleasure, Tim Hunter.
How can I follow that? Everybody hear me okay? I'll just use this. I think it's going to be a little easier. We'll bring the talk up. I said, David should just say, I've known him for many years. He's a good buddy, and he often gives a good talk. And that's the way I should have been introduced. Okay, she said.
Switching microphones. We'll be back in just a second.
I hope you can hear me all right. Okay, very good. Well, we'll go ahead. Is that projecting? Good. Well, I'm going to go over my book. It's not going to be a sales pitch per se for the book. What I want to do is talk about the adventures of being a columnist and writing a book, and then go a little bit about what's involved in the publishing process, or the area I want to go down that path or not.
Sound issue here. We're working on a sound issue. It'll be a minute or two.
How's that? Is that okay for everybody? All right, we'll go ahead then. Well, this first picture is sort of on the back cover of the book. I hope you can see the cursor here. I had the family line up here. This is the daughter, son-in-law, grandchildren, my wife, looking, there's shadow right here, the belt of Venus above it. Here's the moon above that. So the idea is that you can just go out and enjoy the sky from your backyard. Oops. There we go. It's really the adventures of a part-time astronomy columnist. Well, here's a younger version of me, my wife, and David. This is about the time we met. And I always like to comment on pictures like this, since I don't obviously look any different than I did then. The modern cameras must not be as good. Here I am, sitting in front of my computer going to write the Sky Spy. The Sky Spy is a weekly column in the Thursday Caliente section of the Arizona Daily Star. And became a columnist in 2007 because the current columnist at that time had jumped ship and gone to another newspaper. And David had been called up and asked by the editor, Ingrid Sandel at that time, would he like to write the column? He said, no, I'm kind of busy, and suggested my name. She called me literally at work and asked if I'd like to do this because my name was suggested. She sent me a couple of columns, and I was actually familiar with the column. It originally was started by Mike Smith, Dr. Mike Smith, a neurologist. About 20 years prior to that, he was a member of the club, and his columns were fantastic, and they can't be beaten. The volume is still a problem? Well, can people hear in the audience? Okay, I'll try to speak up. So anyway, I wrote a few things for her, and she said that's acceptable. So I started out writing 300 words a week for the column and submitted a picture. And the picture was great because I think I'm a great astrophotographer. Nobody else thinks that. But since I had the column, she'd put the pictures in there. So I got my pictures published along with it, and I would have the drawings. Then one day she calls me up and said, I don't know if you've heard. I said, oh, they dropped in the column. She said, no, no. Well, we no longer have an artist, so we're going to drop the pictures. Then several years after that, called me up and said, would you like to do this twice a month because we have issues with space in the newspaper? I said, why don't we make it 250 words and keep it weekly because we'll lose the momentum. And that's what we've done ever since. So here's, for those who don't get the paper anymore, here's Caliente. This is a really nice section of the paper. It's what you do and see around town. For example, the last 2 issues had a lot on the Tucson Festival of Books and where you park, where you go to, and so forth. And for whatever reason, the astronomy column is in that section of the paper. And I don't know who came up with the term Sky Spy, but I found out very quick that that name is not going to be changed. So here's a typical column where I write about catch Scorpius, the scorpion fleeing or chasing Orion. Explain in the column that Orion was a boastful hunter, and he said that he feared no animal, and the gods are angered. They sent a giant scorpion and stung him and killed him. So they felt bad about that, and they decided to put him in the sky, and they put Scorpius in the sky too. And Orion's either chasing Scorpius or fleeing from Scorpius, because when one rises, the other sets. Well, here's the overview of the book. I had 750 weekly columns, and I said, why don't I just put those together into a book? So one of the things you have to do is remove the date and time-specific things. You can't say, well, you're going to be able to see booties next week with Capella. You have to write in more general terms. I removed most of the Arizona and Tucson specific things, although I left some of them in there because I wanted this more general. But one of the things I wanted to be certain that I didn't do is not just jumble a bunch of columns together and claim it's a book, because there's a lot of repeat. It would be disconjected. So I took bits and pieces, cut and pasted, and tried to make a cohesive whole out of it. And that's up to the reader to decide whether I ever did that or not. Well, the table of content are a little standard, but I'm going to mention a couple of chapters, a little out of the ordinary. The chapter 1, the preface is why I did this, why I'm an amateur astronomer. Chapter 1, what's an amateur astronomer? Well, anybody that looks up and likes the stars, that's an amateur astronomer. You know, get right to chapter 1, could be one sentence. Chapter 2 is the moon, pretty standard chapter. Chapter 3 is the planets, pretty standard. Chapter 4 is the stars, not so standard because it describes stars in general. And I describe my favorite stars and why I like them and how you can see them. Same thing with the constellations. I don't go through every 88 constellations because, one, you can't see some of them here. Number 2, a lot of them are faint and tough to see, but I picked the best ones out and when you can see them. Chapter 6, and I'll get into this a little bit later in the talk, this copy editor who was doing the book said we ought to change that chapter and call it The Wonders of the Sky, where we discuss things like the Milky Way, the zodiacal light, meteor showers, comets. That's something you put in that. Then the seasons in the calendar are important because this comes up every week in the column. And what's the difference between a lunar calendar and a solar calendar? Where do the calendars come from? What's the Tropic of Cancer? What's the Tropic of Capricorn? Things like this. Now, chapters 8 and 9 are really the best part of the book. Chapter 8 is just selected famous astronomers, events, and places. Well, the column would come out every Thursday, and every once in a while it'd be an anniversary date or something. And so I'd write about, may or may not be astronomically related, and I'd write about that. And write about, for example, let's say November 11th. Column might come out Thursday, November 11th. Well, that's Armistice Day or Veterans Day. I said, well, what did the sky look like in France, November 11th of 1918, assuming that you could actually see the sky with all the war going on just before the armistice. And chapter 9 is what I learned as being a columnist. I'm going to mention a little bit later some of my foibles and errors and corrections and feedback from the readers. And then I thought, well, why don't we discuss what telescope you should buy? Now, talking to an amateur astronomy group like this is no big deal. But what you don't want to have somebody do who goes out and reads a column about, a planet or reads a column about a constellation, sees a few beautiful pictures in a book and thinks they can buy a telescope and go look at that, don't know how to set it up, spend a lot of money for it, discouraged, and then they take the telescope and go to the closet. There's nothing worse, other than light pollution, than a telescope sitting in a closet collecting dust. I got some resources, and then I'm big on glossaries. I like to look up terms. And what I like to do in this book, hopefully, is when I introduce a term like the zodiac, for example, I define it right there. Well, let's say somebody reads that and 2 chapters later, they see that term again. They don't remember, well, what's azimuth? Well, I remember seeing that, but I can't quite remember what it is. Well, they can go to the glossary and look it up. And then we have an index. And the index actually paid a professional indexer to do the index. And this is definitely worth it. So what's amateur astronomy? Well, anybody that enjoys the sky. Talk about observing aids. Well, I think the number one, the most important observing aid anybody can get to learning the sky is a planisphere. How many here have planispheres? How many learned the constellations of planispheres? Well, of course, the editor said we have to talk about phone apps because phone apps are good, but I don't find them as good. I have them on my phone. I don't use them very often. I just don't find them as good as a planisphere because you don't get the overview. Now, if you have a computer screen and you're sitting in your office, you get an overview, but you have to walk outside to take a look at the sky. However, for learning the planets, then a phone app would be much better. The planisphere won't do that. Well, here's the planisphere. In fact, this is David Levy's designed planisphere right here. One of the things I did in this talk, almost all the slides are in black and white, even though they were color when I submitted the book, it's in black and white. So I put them like you're going to see them in the book. Because to do a book like this, which has about 50 illustrations, do it in color, it would be prohibitively expensive. Here's an example of terms I introduced in the first chapter. Well, a lot of people don't know what zenith is. They don't know what the celestial meridian is. What's the north celestial pole? What's the south celestial pole? I don't have a drawing in here. What's the celestial equator? Well, these are fairly simple things once you define them. But unless you define them, for somebody just starting out, it's very confusing. Well, the moon. Well, there's the discussion of the phases of the moon. And one of the things I learned, I was in high school, down in the basement, watching a TV in our basement, fixed up room, and I had a tennis ball in my hand, who knows why. And the light from the television hit the tennis ball, and I was moving the tennis ball, and I suddenly realized I learned the phases of the moon. I never understood them until that point. So one of the things I do in this chapter is say, you get yourself in a room, put a lamp, turn the lamp on, have a ball, and move the ball around, and you'll see how the light on the ball changes. And that's how you learn the phases of the moon. All these diagrams and books do nothing for you because until you see it in 3D and understand what's happening, you won't really pick up on it. Here's the diagram that I have. And this is to go outside and take a look. So this is north in the sky, south in the sky, east in the sky. You can't see it over here, west in the sky. And then here's east and west in the moon. And here's first quarter, full, and so forth. And so I go through this so people get an idea about the phases of the moon and learn the moon. By the way, I just pulled this in for that, but this is a fairly early moon. This is 17 hours and 56 minutes right here. Yeah, barely see it. Actually shows up in the book. I was amazed. It's actually a color picture, but well, what's Earthshine? Define that. You know, that's something you can see about 40% of the time. So anytime there's a crescent moon, you can generally see Earthshine. Describe where it is, and the first person that is credited with describing it is Leonardo da Vinci. It's light that reflects off the Earth onto the moon and back from the moon onto the Earth. Apparently, a lot of ancients actually understood this. This is understood way before Da Vinci, but Da Vinci was one of the first people to write it up in a convincing fashion. As the crescent gets larger, the brightness overwhelms the Earthshine, and also there's less light reflecting off the Earth onto the moon. Supermoons are really big nowadays. I don't know where this term came from. Kind of irritates me because I get all kinds of questions about a supermoon. Is simply a full moon when the moon happens to be at perigee, closest to the Earth. So it's about as much as 14% larger than normal. If you didn't know it was a supermoon, you went out and looked at the full moon, you wouldn't notice any different than any other full moon. Here's a picture. I actually took the same scale. So here's actually a supermoon on November 13th, 2016. This was taken about the time the moon was as close to the Earth as ever can get. It's the closest it got in hundreds of years. And here's the previous March, where the moon was apogee. So that's the difference between a full moon at apogee and a full moon at perigee. You know, there's a little bit of difference there. But unless you knew it was going to be that, unless you're really trained to look at the moon, you otherwise wouldn't recognize it. As part of that project, I actually took pictures of the full moon every month for over a year. And I put, this is in the book, you can look at it. I put the date that was taken and the actual distance, the time that was taken. So you can see the scale of the moon changing a little bit, and which I don't really describe in the book, but you can look at I hope the arrow shows up to that. You can see the Mari here, and you can see how the orientation changes from month to month, which would be liberation of the moon. One of the things that actually is surprisingly common in Tucson are moon halos. I've gotten on my website, grasslandsobservatory.com, probably 15 or 20 pictures I've taken from my front yard in Tucson, the moon halos. Every time I go out and see a moon halo, that's once or twice a year at least, I go out and take a wide angle picture of them. They're very beautiful. They're ice crystals up in cirrus clouds. They're small micron-sized ice crystals that apparently refract and reflect light to produce this halo around. And this one night where I took this, turns out there wasn't much clouding up there. So you can actually see the moon right here. It doesn't have to be a full moon, typically is. Jupiter was next to the moon. Castor and Pollux are right here. And so you can see Regulus here. Down here is Sirius. Over here is the constellation Orion. Up here is Capella. This is a wide angle picture. Here's my house down here. You see these same things around the sun. These are also fairly common. Even though it's a dry desert climate here, it's amazing how many nights we get halos around the moon. Well, here's another picture, Earthshine. Here's the moon, crescent moon, right up against the Pleiades. So I love the moon because I've enjoyed watching the phases of it. I've enjoyed it, and I'm not as irritated by it as a lot of amateur astronomers. But it's also very good because it's a good pointer. So for a columnist that wants to point out something, you say, okay, I want you to go out and look at the Pleiades. Well, to us, we're familiar with the sky. The Pleiades are pretty obvious, but somebody just starting out may not be. If I say go out tomorrow night and the moon will be right next to the Pleiades, everybody can find the moon, then they might be able to see the little star cluster there. They might not. I'll say, well, get binoculars, because you might not be able to see the moon, may be too bright. Or just sort of remember where it is at this time of night when the moon moves out of the way. You look up there and you can recognize the Pleiades. And the moon goes by planets, it goes by very bright stars, so it's a great pointer. And here's the obligatory picture of the lunar eclipse, and they go into this in the discussion in the book. And of course, you have to put a picture of a lunar eclipse in the book. And this is I took a number of years ago. But one of the problems of having a black and white book, you don't have the red color that right here, and you don't see the shadows. It sort of shows up okay, and you got to have these kind of pictures in the book, but I really don't think this in black and white does that much justice to what you actually see. And then we have a chapter on the planets. I have some pictures in there. These are pictures. All these pictures I actually took. Now I don't. Mainly the main idea was this is naked eye observing with a little bit of binocular supplementation, and occasionally, if you have the chance to look through a small telescope, I describe what you're going to see. But there's not much emphasis on telescopic visualization. Obligatory picture of the planets looking from above. And of course, I still think Pluto's a planet. That's editorialized in the book. All right. Now, this picture right here that I have is not in the book, but it's a nice picture because it shows the image scale of the planets. And so I just like this, and I used this picture for other talks. Well, we know we're in Arizona. We know actually where Arizona is in relation to the Earth and the sun. This is a picture actually I'm kind of proud of. This is one of my few published astro photos. And this was taken in January 26, 1984, taken with a wide-angle lens. It was taken actually up at Catalina Middle School, looking back over the city. This is all the planets at 90 degrees of the sky. So here's Mercury, here's Venus, here's Jupiter. The moon, I'm not sure what phase it was at. Could have been full, but it probably overexposed. Right here is the constellation of Scorpius. You see Antares right here. Here's Saturn, here's Mars, and here's Spica. One of the things that always used to bug me, I always read about elongation. That's a fancy term. We would say Mercury is at greatest elongation from the sun. Well, it just means the distance. So I just thought, I'm going to have a picture of this. So here's a picture of Mercury at greatest eastern elongation. Well, that's after sunset. When you think about it, well, no, it's in the west. No, because Mercury is east of the sun, so it's the greatest eastern distance from the sun. So you're going to see that after sunset. Here's one in the morning, western elongation. So here's Mercury, and this happens to be, and I can't, it's because the text is coming up on the screen. I can't see what date that I have there, but basically I have this just to illustrate what we mean when we talk about elongation. So if I write in a column, it's the greatest elongation, go out and take a look. It means just the greatest distance and the best chance of actually seeing it. Mercury is actually quite easy to see, but you've got to, it's bright, but you've got to be able to look at it because it doesn't stay around very long. You can see Venus in the daytime. I think most of us know that. I find it extremely hard. I've seen it only a couple times in the daytime. Once you see it, it's actually fairly bright, but you got to look at the exact spot. Well, on this particular day, Venus, which is right here with the arrow, was very close to the moon, which is visible about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Sunset was around 6:30. So I went out and took a picture, and I was lucky to get an airplane in the same thing. So this is Venus in the daytime. So you need to know exactly where it is. You probably need to have the sun behind a tree or behind a building, and then you look for Venus. Well, here's a picture of a transit of Mercury. They're not very common. They're not real rare, but they're not going to be one anytime soon. And here's a picture I took actually with David in Montreal in 2004, the transit of Venus. So I mentioned that, even though this is not something you're going to be seeing anytime soon. Certainly not the transit of Venus. And here's the obligatory pictures of, there again, the eclipse of the sun and eclipse of the moon. And here's a picture. This was taken in 2017 from Madras, Oregon. Now, this is great that it's black and white. Now, it doesn't do the justice to it. However, since my totality pictures were out of focus and blurred, when you make it black and white and you shrink it down from the book, it doesn't look too bad. And there's an annular eclipse actually taken from Page, Arizona. So just for illustration for somebody, and one of the points I do make in the book is if anybody has a chance to see a total eclipse of the sun, you should never pass it up. That's the greatest spectacle in nature. It is so overwhelming that you can't describe it. And I've had friends who go on eclipse trips, and once they see it, just it's so stunning because the entirety of the sky is taken up a phenomenon from the eclipse. So I try to emphasize people should never miss it if they can, if they have a chance to go see one. Well, here's, when we talk about conjunctions, here's the conjunction December 2020. Here's actually the crescent moon, but here's when Jupiter and Saturn became very close together. Talk about stars. What's a star? It's a big ball of gas that's tried to shrink. When it shrinks, it gets hot. That makes it want to expand. So it's a constant battle between shrinking and expanding. If there's enough mass there, it gets hot enough that you set off nuclear explosions in the interior, and the star goes on for millions to billions of years. What star brightness is a discussion of magnitude, how it's measured. Star names is actually a fairly nice discussion, I think, in this, where I discuss the star names, the Bayer names, the Plant Street names, the common names, and so forth. And people can look this up. And then talk about star colors. Star colors are kind of subtle, but once you recognize them, and once you start observing stars, particularly in the moon's away, you can recognize the colors of the stars. And then I have a list of my favorite bright stars, which you just described. Well, here's a couple of stars we can see from Arizona. You should all go out and try to see these. Here's Achenar. Took this from my observatory in Sonoita, just rising over the mountains. And here's Gamma Crux. Anybody know what Gamma Crux is? That's the top star in the Southern Cross, which we can see from Arizona. And you can actually see it from Kitt Peak, and this is actually taken a little south of Kitt Peak in here. Now, of course, you can't see much else, and this is actually a very bright red star. By the way, here's Omega Centauri. I'll come back to Achenar a little bit later. And I just a picture in front of my house of constellations and stars like the Shuba, the Grapheus, Pi Scorpii, Antares. Oh, my two favorite, Zumel Shamali, Zumel Genubi. I mention these in columns, and I say every time I mention these, I have to really check carefully to make sure that I've actually spelled them correctly. And Ophiuchus is a constellation I said doesn't get the fame that it deserves. It's a big constellation, not real bright, but big. It's actually on the zodiac, but nobody ever hears of it. Why? Because nobody likes to name the name Ophiuchus. There's a couple others. Just show Capella and Auriga. Taurus the Bull. I mentioned the Taurus is a V-shaped, Aldebaran. And then the Pleiades. And the reason I show this is because you get an idea what the size of the Pleiades is in respect to the other constellations. Here's an overview. I live near the three towers in North Swan, and just show the overview of Polaris, Little Dipper, Big Dipper's not up here is Perseus, which I don't indicate in this thing, but right in here's the double cluster. And I will mention the double clustering column because that's visible to the naked eye. It doesn't take that dark a sky to see it. It's certainly gorgeous in binoculars. And of course the Pleiades, and we have down here Orion, and of course the Orion Nebula is something else I mentioned because there again, that's visible to the naked eye and certainly very beautiful in binoculars and a small telescope. Well, what's the evening star or morning star? Well, it's almost always Venus. I'd say it's a nice thing, but it's nothing special about it. Sometimes it's Jupiter. Mars can get brighter Jupiter on rare occasions, so it could be Mars if Venus is not up, and even maybe Sirius depending on the circumstances. So here's an example of one morning, actually. This is Jupiter right here next to Scorpius. So Jupiter was the morning star. Then constellations, the same thing. What's a constellation? Well, it's just a collection of stars that we've given a name to that our culture has recognized. No different, no special meaning to them. Most of them don't look like what they're supposed to be. A few of them are. When they do look like they're supposed to be, then I really emphasize that. And this is a picture that what used to be, these kind of pictures used to be in the column until the artist was no longer. So I would actually draw these with a computer and then send them in, and they would then make them the configuration for the column. This is, for example, what you would see in late April, looking east about 9 o'clock or so, you see the constellations. And people, I think, get an idea. You still need to work to go out and actually see these things. Well, one of the things that is important that I make the point is I love Sirius in Canis Major. Here's Sirius right here, and here's Canopus. That's right, Joe. This is actually taken from my backyard. You can see how bright Canopus is. You can see Canopus over the sky globe of Tucson. So there's no reason why somebody should not go out and be able to look for these things. It's amazing how much you can see if you make a little bit of effort. And, light pollution is something I've been battling for a number of years. And one of the things I've learned, if you can just tone the lights down just a little bit, it's amazing how much more you can get back. Another view of constellations. And the reason I show this picture, because I enhanced this, actually kind of cheated here a little bit. But M31, big galaxy. It's quite visible to the naked eye and quite a nice sight and wide, big binoculars. It's actually better binoculars probably than most telescopes because it's a very wide angle object. Right here is the Deneb, Vega, and Altair. So I occasionally mention the summer triangle. Well, here's a picture. Now you're not going to be able to see it this nice in a telescope or nice binoculars, but you're going to see an awful lot of detail. This is really a beautiful object. Here's the double cluster I mentioned. This is something else people can see with their naked eye. Here I am, a younger version of myself, pointing out with a laser pointer the Pleiades. So here's the picture of the Pleiades. Emphasize now that people are not going to probably see the nebulosity of binoculars. You might, depending on the binoculars and the conditions. And I only see 6 stars. It's the 7 stars. There's some debate about where it got the name of 7 stars. There's actually, of course, a lot more stars in it. And people on dark sky sites with very good eyesight can see 10 or 12 stars naked eye, and you can see, 30 or 50 of them with binoculars, and you can see hundreds with a telescope, depending on what size of the cluster you want to attribute it to. And certainly with a small telescope, you can see the nebulosity. Well, the Milky Way is discussed because the Milky Way is a gorgeous sight. Now, I'd say the total eclipse of the moon or the sun, by far the most stunning thing you can see in nature. But the summer Milky Way and dark sky sight overhead in the middle of the summer is a distant second, but it's still the second. It is unbelievably magnificent. And the zodiacal light can be very bright if you're out of town. So here's the Milky Way. This is a wide angle picture. The Milky Way setting on a summer August evening. Here's the winter Milky Way. Here we go. See right here. It's not as nice as the summer, but there's a lot to see. And there again, we can see Sirius, Procyon, Gastropollux. Here's Orion, Taurus, the Pleiades. There again, you get an idea, relative scale. And here's right here. This is light pollution from Tucson. Here's Sierra Vista. This is taken down in Sonoyta. And then I talk about the Great Rift. Everybody seen the Great Rift in the Milky Way? It's quite easy to see when you see the Milky Way very well. Here's the zodiacal light. So here's the Milky Way in the northwest, and here's the zodiacal light in the west. It's quite bright, quite easy to see once you get out of town. The seasons, we won't go into this too much. But it's important to mention the Tropic of Capricorn, the Tropic to Cancer, the calendar, how the calendar arise, basically because of Julius Caesar and Pope Gregory, the ones that actually put the calendars that we use there. Then I selected calendar dates, talk a little bit about meteor showers. Comets, not so much because they're unpredictable. And I typically write the column 3 or 4 weeks ahead. So it's very hard to make any bets about a comet. The Earth's shadow is something I'm really going to emphasize, because that's something you can see every day, every single day, twice a day, if you have a wide enough horizon that's not totally cloudy. And that's something until I was fairly long in my amateur astronomy career before I actually recognized the Earth's shadow. It is a phenomenal thing. It's gorgeous. I love to see it. I talk about what are the various zones of twilight? How is twilight defined? We just use that term. It's actually definitions of it. How about coordinated universal time or Greenwich Mean Time? And of course, the obligatory picture of the seasons. I already mentioned these. The equinox and solstice is always a column on these. So there's 4 columns a year get written. I can just cut and paste from the previous column, change the dates, and I'm on my way. So I kind of like them when that time of year comes along. Now, the selected calendar dates, because the column would on a Thursday, an occasional Thursday. Well, anybody, Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1912. What happened that day? Anybody know? Arizona admitted to the Union. Okay, talk about Easter and Passover. What happened 15 March 44 BC? Beware of the Ides of March. Caesar was assassinated. Memorial Day used to be on May 30th. When I grew up, it was on May 30th. I still think of Memorial Day as May 30th. Now, it got changed in 1971. And it originated from Decoration Day. After the Civil War, people in late May would gather, both the Confederate states and the northern states, and lay flowers and wreaths and stuff on the tombs of people killed in the war. And so it became Decoration Day, and eventually became formalized and became May 30th. Now, the late Senator Inouye from Hawaii, who was I think a Medal of Honor winner, and was a Japanese American and mistreated, he fought in Europe and became a war hero. He always thought Memorial Day should be on May 30th, because we honor people who were killed in the war. So that's a very significant date. He thought it should never be changed, and I sort of am the same thing. D-Day, June 6, 1944. What happened then? Invasion of Normandy in the Second World War. Little discussion of the tides and why that day was chosen. Bastille Day, the charging of Bastille, July 14, 1789, Apollo 11 Day. How many remember that? We got a little more mature audience here. Dog Days of Summer. So I like this because I always think of my old dog, Bozo, lying under the elm trees in Arlington Heights, Illinois. Of course, Bozo's no longer there. The elm trees are no longer there. The skies are no longer free of light pollution. But certainly in Roman times and Egyptian times, the time of Christ, or even before that, Sirius used to rise quite early in the morning in the summertime, about the time of the flooding of the Nile. So they called this was a dog star, the dog days of hot summers coming. You could still see Sirius as early as late July or early August, early in the morning if you look for it. So I discussed that. Veterans Day, we already mentioned November 11th, 1918. Thanksgiving, every column, there's always a Thanksgiving column. I'm thankful that this is astronomy capital of the world. I'm thankful for my freedom, relative prosperity. To discuss Astronomy Day, Globe at Night, something we all ought to know about. So here's Sirius, which you can see actually in the summer sky, late summer sky. Meteor showers. The only ones I really mentioned are the Perseids, the Leonids, and the Geminids. And then occasional comet. Here's Comet Neowise from a few years ago. Was bright. It was bright for long enough so I could mention that. But as a general rule, I stay away from comets in the column because they're so unpredictable. This is the Earth's shadow, not a very good picture, but here's the shadow of the Earth. So the Earth's shadow goes completely along the horizon. So this is a sunset. So I'm looking to the east. So the sun's setting behind me, and here's the shadow of the Earth coming up. And there's an orange zone here called the belt of Venus, which is refracted light. And this happens to be the full moon above the Earth's shadow. And I also mentioned famous astronomers and places. I have to mention the American Astronomical Society. Yuri Gagarin, his birthday happened to fall in a column. Now, my favorite is Cecilia Payne Gaposchkin. She was born into a relatively prosperous family in England, was a brilliant person, fabulous mathematician. She actually got I think, a mathematics degree, certainly some type of scientific degree, undergraduate degree from Cambridge University. She wanted to go on to get a doctorate, and women were not allowed to get doctorates in those days, certainly not in astronomy or physics. Harlow Shapley, who was the director of Harvard Observatory, allowed her to come over and do a graduate degree at Harvard College Observatory. And she completed her PhD there in the late 20s. And her PhD thesis is considered the most brilliant PhD thesis ever written in astronomy. She is the person that determined in her thesis that most of the universe is made up of hydrogen and helium, and all the other elements are a very small percentage. This had not been realized in that time. And that thesis is probably a Nobel Prize winning equivalent. Well, she obviously had a very successful career. She went on to become director of the observatory a number of years later, first woman professor of astronomy at Harvard, and also the head of the department at Harvard. So she was fabulous. And I think, I don't know this to be a fact, she was a very avid smoker. I think she actually died of lung cancer, but I don't really know that to be the case. Excuse me. George Heithley was a very prominent. I actually got a chance to meet her. She's most famous for the Yale Bright Star Catalog. She actually got the von Biesbrock Award for a lifetime service in astronomy. I was actually on the committee. She actually came to Tucson this a number of years ago and she received the award. We talk about the International Astronomical Union. I've got to go plug for IDA, the International Dark Sky Association. Lowell Observatory happened to be its founding date, was one of the dates of the columns I wrote about Percival Lowell and the founding observatory. Charles Messier, of course, he's mentioned many times because of the Messier objects. Maria Mitchell was very thing. She discovered a number of comets, but she was also an abolitionist and a woman's liver is not the proper. They used those terms that day. She was women's rights. So not only she was famous for her comet discoveries, for becoming a professor of astronomy at Vassar, but also for her work as an abolitionist. NASA was founded July 29th, 1958. Whenever I wrote the column on that, it was a Thursday. Planetary Science Institute, which is a Tucson-based organization, best group of planetary scientists in the world, so I have to mention them. Sputnik, October 4th, 1957. One of the low points of my little amateur astronomy career, I remember coming down from my bedroom, and there's a newspaper lying on the desk in the little hallway, and there was the headlines from the Chicago Tribune, the Russians launched a satellite, and I was just horrified that they beat us to it. It was actually probably very good for my education and very good for the U.S. in the long term, but at the time it seemed really somewhat bittersweet. I remember it. And Clyde Tombaugh, because of David, I got a chance to meet Clyde Tombaugh and get to know him, and I certainly believe Pluto's a planet. In fact, Clyde Tombaugh actually spoke at TAAA. I found this little card here. David, do you know what date that he was here? They spoke to TAAA? 1983. And here's a younger version of David and unfortunately Wendy, who are with us, and Patsy and Clyde. Just wonderful people, which through David and Wendy, I was able to chance to get to meet them. So I'm very loyal to Pluto. Well, what did I learn along the way? I made a lot of errors, actually. One of the things you want to do is not get the wrong dates and times on things. So I'm really careful of that. So the most common question I have, what's that bright star? Or what's that bright light? Usually it's Venus. Because usually somebody would describe it well enough, you could say, well, okay, I sort of know what that is. Sometimes they saw a flash of light somewhere. They can't describe exactly what time it was, what part of the sky it was, and what it was doing. So you're only a guess. Could have been a meteor, could have been an airplane, could have been a, International Space Station, could have been their imagination, who knows? Then why do stars twinkle and planets don't? People would ask that. I never paid much attention to that until I actually started looking and say, yeah, that actually is true. Planets don't. They really don't twinkle hardly at all, and stars do twinkle most of the time. And I love this one I got a few times. Why isn't your column in Caliente in a common place? Like up front, maybe, and I said, well, tell the editor that, and ask for it to be up front. Well, that didn't seem to work. And I haven't seen this for a few years, but it used to be every August there would be this thing coming around that Mars is going to be as big as the full moon. And I would articles about that. And then people would say, why can't I see the Milky Way? Well, maybe because there's light pollution, or maybe because it's the wrong time of year. Depends. Well, sometimes things go wrong and you really get bad feedback. This is one I wrote about the summer triangle. Asterism is a grouping of stars in the sky. So the editors write the headlines for the column. Why? And she put the word asterisk. And I looked at that and I was just horrified. So I called the editor up and said, that's asterisms. Oh my goodness. What should we do? I said, well, I don't know. Maybe nothing. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody complained. And I think about as years go by, this is actually probably a much better column, a much better headline than if I put asterism. Well, here's a picture I took of Echo 1 satellite, 1962, with my father's Ronnie Hawkeye camera. So the editors, maybe about 10 years ago, got the idea that we would put a sidebar on the moon. So I'd say the moon is what phase and when it's going to be full or first or last quarter. And we have another sidebar for bright satellites. I should have known better than this. This is really one of my really big blunders. So I write about ISS, HST, and maybe a couple of very bright satellites and put their predicted times. Well, it turns out you can't predict satellites with any degree of accuracy more than a few days ahead of time. This is actually a relativistic effect. And of course, when people would go out, and I'd be 20 minutes off. And people say, I didn't see it. What's going on here? And then I suddenly realized that this is an incredible blunder, and we stopped doing that. We sort of quietly hid that. One week it was there, and the next week it wasn't. There's a young girl, she's 13, an 8th grader, Alana, wrote in, what are the benefits of being an astronomer? What is the average salary? I could write in a book on all this. Describe a typical workday. Actually, answered all these things. It's in the book. What would be disadvantage of astronomy for career? Well, low pay, probably. Are there various levels of the job? Yes. What characteristics you need to do well in this career? It depends on what you're going to do. What's the highest position in astronomy? What's the lowest position in astronomy? Well, astronomy columnist is the lowest position in astronomy. Well, here's my telescope. This is a Criterion 4-inch reflector. This is taken about 1958. So here's my telescope, my piggy bank, my globe, and our elm trees. And everything I saw, they're all gone. When I was in the military overseas, my parents gave that telescope to a boy down the street because they thought he was going to be interested in astronomy. I never know what happened to it. He could be a famous astrophysicist today, and I wouldn't know it. So what telescope should you buy? Well, to the average person, I'd say none. Get a planisphere and learn the sky. Get a good pair of binoculars. What I mean is 8 by 50, 7 by 50, something you can easily hold up. You can go out and look at the birds, and you can take the football game and enjoy them. They'll be perfectly fine at night. And then once you get to know the sky better and have a better idea, then you can buy binoculars that are more expensive to design for night observing. Then you try to find an astronomy buddy. That's always the best way to learn something, is to have a good buddy. Join an astronomy club like the TAAA, go to their star parties, look through telescopes, and when you do that, then you can figure out what you would like to have. You can read reviews online, and now, of course, the Tucson, the TAAA Telescope Library Program. Actually, a woman that I'm a professor emeritus, but I still do some stuff on one of the women's things, borrowed a telescope from the library. And she used it for about a month, and she loved it. So this is fantastic. Here's a variety of resources. Let me just mention a couple of these, because these are actually quite good. There's a very good but limited glossary on Swinburne Astronomy online, Encyclopedia of Astronomy, called Cosmos. I use that all the time. Here's my website. May or may not be good. The premier website for satellite observations, Heavens Above. Here's the IDA website. The best website for stars, learn about stars, Jim Kaler's website. If you want to look what you can see in the sky like a naked eye observing, I use this all the time. The Abrams Planetarium. This comes from Michigan State University. And here's, of course, the Tucson trip, the TAAA. Here's a variety of terms. I'm not going to define these, but terms I think everybody should know. Asterism, not versus asterisks. Crescent, evening star, gibbous, more than half lit, meridian, sunrise, sun. Actually, I looked up the definition of sunrise and sunset. I actually did know the exact definition of it. A little slightly different than I thought. Waxing and waning. Well, these are simple. So what's a waxing gibbous moon? Well, that sounds terrible. You can go out and see the waxing gibbous. Well, that just means the moon is more than half lit. It's getting more lit every day. The zodiac seems mysterious. Well, that's just the path in the sky the planets fall. Well, what if you want to write a book? So I'm going to put the rest of the talk here. We'll try to take too long and talk about what's it like to write a book. So I wouldn't laugh, Jack. I know things about you. And I was going to write a Time Life series of books on home surgery. Why write a book? To make money. Well, I can dispel that. I can hear the authors in the audience laughing. Well, David's made a good living at it, but I have so far not. To become famous, there again, it depends on how you define it. To get promotion and tenure, yes, and I'll show you why. To produce a useful collection of information materials for others, well, you would hope so. To leave a legacy, well, yeah, possibly. To produce something that's needed and not previously been done. Well, I can't really say that my book is exactly that thing, but it's a little bit unique on that. The sense of accomplishment. So I think that probably is the number one thing, the sense of accomplishment. These others, I think, are more problematic. Here's the computer and radiology. I wrote this when computers were first coming into radiology. This actually did get me my tenure. Here's a radiologic guide to medical devices and foreign bodies. I think I got my professorship partially because of this. Why not write a book? Well, it's really hard. It takes a lot of time. Often takes more writing skills than one possesses, and you don't know where to start. Now, I think the moneymaker in amateur astronomy would be a novel on murder at the star party. But I've got this. I haven't quite outlined it yet. And since I've never written any fiction that was any good, I think it's going to be problematic because the first fiction book anybody writes is usually pretty terrible. In fact, it may be so bad that it's kind of entertaining. So I said that's something to David, because David's a great writer, and maybe David should do Murder at the Star Party and have all kinds of astronomical features put in with it. Well, how can a book cost money? Well, you have to have somebody help you with the manuscript production. Somebody has to do the copy editing. I'm going to get into that in a second. I paid for a professional index. I've had books that had poor indexes. I remember when my first book came out, I wanted to look something up in it. I knew it was in the book because I'd written it. I couldn't find it in the index. It's kind of frustrated me. And then if you want to have figures drawn, I don't draw very well. Some of those stick figures I can do, but anything that's nice, and I'll show the figures, you have to pay the artist to do that. Here's the picture that I showed earlier. This is actually a color that I got. It's a beautiful picture. Unfortunately, it comes out black and white in the book because we can't put color in this because the book's too expensive. Why not to write a book? Because you get talked into it by others who promise to do most of the work and don't show up. This is the Radiologic Guide to Orthopedic Devices. About the time I was retiring, I said, why don't we do a website and a book on how orthopedic devices like rods and nails and things like this, knee joints and so forth, look on x-rays. It's something that I was an expert on and enjoyed. And so a junior faculty member said, oh, I want to do that. I've got all this information, I'll help you with it. About 6 months later, he promptly quit and moved to San Francisco and was no longer interested in it. I'd meanwhile signed the contract with a publisher, and while there's nothing going to happen to you if you don't produce the book, it doesn't look very good if you ever want to do something in the future. And so I spent a good part of my first year or so after retirement doing this book. This is from Cambridge University Press. It's a nice book, but didn't get rich off it. How do you publish your book? Find a publisher. That's ideal. But that's tough. Or self-publish. Now, self-publishing has actually become pretty good. And some people have very good luck at that. It's much different than it used to be the old days where you'd pay some publisher a lot of money to publish your book. You can actually do it in an electronic version and it doesn't cost you very much money. Now, there are a couple of downsides to that. And here's a couple that self-published. They were quite good. Mike Wiesner, who lives in Oracle, his book is an autobiography, Finding My Way to the Stars. Really very interesting book. I really recommend this highly. And another one, Burley Packwood, is a very good amateur astronomer, and he takes astrophotography, lives in Green Valley, and he published his book, both self-published. And I actually talked to him about their stuff. One of the things that intrigued me, and this is the only books I could find in our library that were made by TAAA published members. So David has many books. The one his biography, autobiography, is a wonderful book. I really recommend it. Deep Sky and Earth Enthusiasm by Todd. A little book of Astronomical Curiosity by Robert Douglas, and then the Michael Bakich I see here. One of his books, he's got several thousand celestial wonders to see before you die. And that, of course, made him a lot of money, right? Okay. One of the things I think on one of my little quests, I talked to May about this, we should try to find all the books that people in the club members have written, just make a list somewhere and keep it. Why work hard to find a publisher? Well, hopefully they do better advertising and better induction to your intended audience. The one thing that I think publishers do, and my experience has been the copy editing is extremely important. And publishers do the copy editing much better than the author can do, certainly much better than I can do. Along with that is proofreading. Copy editing and proofreading go together. They probably also give a better layout to the book, although there's a lot of programs now that allow you to do your own layout, so you might be able to do just as good a job, but I think that publishers can do a better job. Copy editing, I think, is probably the most important reason to get a publisher. They find the errors in the spelling and punctuations. They find the incomplete sentences. They find the missing quote marks, the missing parentheses. They fact check. If they're very good, they fact check everything you say, and they have internal consistency. So they say, well, you said this over here in chapter 3, but you say this over here, you say this about Venus in chapter 3, but you said something different about Venus over here in chapter 4, which is correct. And by the way, the figure you gave for the diameter of Venus in chapter 2 isn't the same one you have in the table in chapter 8. You think you've got everything covered. And they do the plagiarism check, which is very important. Make sure that everything you do is not plagiarized and it's been properly used, properly copyrighted. You may either give credit or you use the proper use of copyright materials. So here's the star Achenar. What's wrong with this picture? I showed this earlier, but it was more minimized. This is what I submitted to the publisher. The copy of the picture. This is misspelled. This word is misspelled. Achenar is misspelled. There's an R missing. This is the way it should be. So I had to correct this. The copy editor picked that up. It'd be kind of embarrassing. I'm an amateur astronomer. I'm very experienced in a lot about amateur astronomy. Yeah, right. But I can't even spell the name of the star. What about copyright and plagiarism issues? You have to have permission to use any copyrighted materials not owned by yourself. You can't even plagiarize yourself. You've written something somewhere else. You can't take that out and put it in your book without at least making attributions for it. Typically, once you publish something, the publisher owns that. They own it from then on. You can't just use it without permission, or certainly without citing it. But you can do, and most publishers allow this, you can retain permission to further use your images and illustrations that are owned or retained by yourself. So those pictures I've showed you, I own those and I can use them anywhere else I want. Although I should refer back to where they were first published. Port starboard. Can't you speak English? Take me to your stove. Well, you want to have the proper terms. I just had to put this in here. So proofreading. I collected things. My favorite here, I'll just let you read these, is kids make nutritious snacks. If you don't allow court to try shooting defendants, I think that's a good idea too. I also like the one, police begin campaign to run down jaywalkers. Oh, I won't mention the panda mating fail. Well, this kind of stuff appears. I mean, this is stuff that's presumably taken out of headlines. Here's a couple others. Well, what kind of book size you're going to have? You should have an idea what your book size is. The book here, and I have 10 copies, which we're just going to give to the audience. We're going to raffle off. Is 51,835 words as submitted. I don't know actually how it came out printed, a little bit less maybe. 50 figures, so it's 208 pages. So last night I actually fiddled around with this on a double-spaced 12 font times Roman numeral page. Is about 325 words per page, so you get a rough idea. I have another book, hopefully it's going to be coming out sometime this year, Springer Nature. It's called The Barnard Objects Then and Now. A little more sophisticated book. It's going to have 100,000 words and about 180 figures, and they're going to be in colors. So I don't know I'll be bringing 10 copies of that book to the club to give away, assuming that makes it. Well, you want to take the pledge. I just love this cartoon. You have to look at that pigeon. So how do you get a publisher? Well, it's always easier if you're already known a published author. Well, this is sort of like, how do you get started, I think it's easier and best to have the book already written, or at least in a rough form, rather than saying have an idea. Because you can send them a chapter, you can send them a preface, which I've done, and that helped. When you contact the publisher, basically you're going to get no response from a lot of these people. I didn't have the courtesy anymore to say no. You might get a rejection. I didn't actually get this rejected by a couple of places. Didn't get a rejection letter. Nobody just ever got back to me. Well, you should know your subject well and know the publishers that cover that subject. Interestingly enough, they're going to want the contact information and names of people that review the manuscript. Because they're going to send this out blinded. You won't know who these reviewers are. And they're going to make reviews of it and then come back. And they'd like to have you suggest. They may or may not have people that do this kind of book, but certainly want your suggestions. And it's about a 2-year period from the time you first contact the publisher until you actually get the book out. And this is a timeline. I won't go through this, but basically roughly the timeline for the present book. So a little final thoughts. How do you get started? Well, I'm a firm believer in outlining. I didn't actually understand what outline meant until years ago when I actually decided to start writing things. I always thought it was just a task that some school teacher imposed upon us. Didn't understand that. Somehow the concept had never reached me then. I think if you outline things, I'm very serious about this. In some detail, you'll get much help to get started. And then I think, for me, it takes best in tackling small doses, a couple hours a day, an hour a day, but keep it momentum going. You should know similar work, so you either emulate them or improve on them. You need to know how is your work unique or different, what's your intended audience, and they're going to ask who's going to buy the book and how many copies will I be able to sell. All right, well, this is it. Thank you very much. And I hope I made an impressionable moment on you here. I'm all finished. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to ask people to start formulating questions, and people who were on Facebook or on Zoom, make sure to type in your questions, and we'll cover questions in the room here first, and those people will have an opportunity to type in whatever they need to. So we have a question in the room. Okay. And a reminder is that it takes me a few minutes to get to people asking questions because I'm moving around the room here to carry the microphone to them.
When you were covering the astronomical dates or calendar dates, I don't recall if you mentioned Easter. Easter somehow got a astronomical connotation as being the first Sunday after the full moon.
Yeah, I did. I
after.
actually mentioned Easter on that list is Easter and Passover, but I didn't in the discussion. I didn't.
It just seems strange that there's an astronomical connotation. Why not the first Sunday in April or whatever?
Right. No, this is quite ancient. The lunar calendar, actually.
Okay, other questions in the room?
Turns out lunar calendars, just for a second, are different because some lunar calendars are new moon to new moon. Some are full moon to full moon, depending on the society. Yeah, Ramadan, yeah, new moon to new moon.
Okay, another question for Tim? Well, Tim, I think you had a great deal of clarity in your talk.
I hope so. Or
Okay, yes. We will go then to one of our other audiences here. No Facebook?
Okay, Susan Rubin on Zoom said, I thought if there was a halo around the moon that there'd be precipitation the next day, snow or rain. And know if there's any truth to that?
I don't think there's any truth to that. The other one that I think that that is actually sort of false. Red sky in the morning, sailors take warning, and red sky at night, sailors delight. I think there's very little proof of that. Some of these others are, but I think that one, no.
Susan also comments, dark skies help astronomers and also help bats and migratory birds. Hearing about great women in astronomy during Women's History Month is awesome. Sue, let's see where to go. Sue Jordan. I'm going the wrong direction, I think. Will his book be available at the book fair?
Yes.
All right, he will be at the book
In
fair.
fact, the shameless ad is I will be signing books at the book fair on Sunday from 10 to 10:30 at the U of A Press booth.
All right, and that's it on Zoom.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Tim. We really appreciate this. And Tim is always, oh, do we have another question? Okay.
Tim's book will be available in our library starting at the April general meeting.
Great. Thank you, Doug.
Yeah, I brought 10 books to raffle off for the audience. So those that are interested, stay around till we do it.
Yes. Okay, so thank you very much. I think at this point, we're going to say thank you to our Facebook people for coming. We're really glad that you were with us tonight, and we hope that you will come back again. We're here the first Friday of every month at 6:30. And we hope that you look up our club on the web at TucsonAstronomy.org. And we have lots of interesting things on our websites and opportunities to join and opportunities to donate. And we love to hear from you. So please keep in touch with us and visit us again.